which is what we were drinking. This would sharpen you up and make you ready for a bit of the old ultra-violence.
But I remember saying to him once, well, look, Stanley, look, how do you direct? I mean, what's your style? And he said, I really don't know. I never know what I want, but I do know what I don't want. I don't think I've really ever had that much fun on a job. I mean, I've worked with other great directors and certainly Lindsay Anderson, but actually the actual fun of doing the work, which was, of course, in the character of Alex, too. He was a wicked son of a bitch. But the great thing that I think Stanley and I had in common is a wicked sense of humor.
It was my rabbit to help the prison Charlie with the Sunday service. He was a bolshy, great, burly bastard. But he was very fond of myself, me being very young, and also now very interested in the big book. I didn't so much like the latter part of the book, which is more like all preachy talking than fighting in the old in-out. I like the parts where these old Yehudis toe-chock each other and then drink their Hebrew vino, and getting onto the bed with their wives' handmaidens. That kept me going.
He explored these extreme subjects that you kind of sometimes wanted to recoil from, like in Clockwork Orange. But they were explored in a way that was dissecting them, truly dissecting them to try to find out what makes that kind of evil tick. And I think that there was a search behind all of those films to say, in a way, in a world where we know man is capable of the most base, shockingly destructive behavior, is hope and virtue possible?
Go on, do me in, you bastard cowards. We don't want to live anyway. Not in a stinking water like this.
Oh? And what's so stinking about it?
What's soft about water is it at all? Men on that moon, and men spinning around the earth, and there's not no attention paid to earthly law and order no more. Oh, dear little land, I fought for thee.
You'd have to say that, you know, Stanley's view of human nature was, you know, really very, very bleak. It's fairly miraculous in this day and age in particular to have pursued the kind of career he pursued and making these uncompromising movies.
It had been a wonderful evening, and what I needed now to give it the perfect ending was a bit of the old Ludwig van.
In a way, Kubrick's playing around, in the sense of the music, with what he'd done previously. Having taken like a real classical music score for his previous film, now he's saying, okay, well, we're going to have Beethoven, but we're also going to have the William Tell overture played 5 times too fast. Kubrick's being playful in the same way as when Alex visits the record store, there in the record rack is a copy of 2001, which is obviously is a great joke, but also he's also talking about a film director who has given up being influenced by others, a film director whose primary influence has become himself.
For now it was lovely music that came to my aid. There was a window open with a stereo on, and I viddied right at once what to do.
I did 2 weeks of narration. It was like the purest kind of filmmaking. You know, just a Sennheiser microphone and a Nagra. That's all he had. No operator. It was Stanley pushing the button. That was it. And it was highly, concentrated. So I'd say, well, I've got to stretch my legs, Stanley. He'd say, ping pong. He was always trying to beat me. He never did. Not at ping pong. Chess, another matter. Anyway, so we'd have fun, we'd play, and we'd come back, we'd do another piece. The voiceover works very well. So about, I think maybe 6 months later, my agent said, oh, by the way, Malcolm, you have 2 weeks of voiceover you haven't been paid for yet. I went, well, I'm going out to see Stanley this afternoon. I'll mention it to him. So as I was leaving, I think I said, oh, by the way, Stanley, my agent informs me that I haven't been paid for the 2 weeks narration. He had a slide rule in his pocket. He took the slide rule out. He went like this, and he went, I'll pay you for a week. I went, a week? He goes, yep, the other week was ping pong.
Oh, bliss. Bliss and heaven. Oh, it was gorgeousness and gorgeosity made flesh. It was like a bird of rarest spun heaven metal, or like silvery wine flowing in a spaceship, gravity all nonsense now. As I sluiced it, I knew such lovely pictures.
Stanley and Malcolm McDowell got along like a house on fire. Stanley was very happy with the choice of Malcolm, and he delivered spectacularly well. We became very, very close. I, of course, thought that this was a great friendship, and that I expected to be part of his life. And I didn't understand at the time, being a young actor and not having done very many films, so being somewhat inexperienced, that, that the way of a film life is intense relationship, separate. Intense relationship, separate. So I was expecting the relationship to carry on in some form, but he cut it like this. He didn't really want to know. It was over for him. I think the other thing is this. Some of the things that I said about him, which were perhaps unfair, maybe it was a cry out to say, Stanley, pick up the phone and call me. And, of course, he never did.
I have arranged a little surprise for you.
Surprise?
One that I hope that you will like. As a, how shall we put it? As a symbol of our new understanding. An understanding between two friends.
A Clockwork Orange dealt in part with media exploitation, but now real life imitated art. The film was blamed for many brutal crimes committed by youths claiming to have been inspired by the film's violence. The press and public reaction had a devastating impact on Kubrick and his family.
The attack on Clockwork Orange was fierce in Britain. It was unbelievable. He was directly accused of murder and mayhem. And then every crime in England was because of Clockwork Orange.
Stanley was accused of inciting violence, and it became very, very ugly. He got terrible letters, almost death threats. In fact, there were some death threats.
He asked Warner's, "Can you please help me? I can't live here if this keeps going on. I'm afraid to send my children to school. My house is besieged. I don't know what to do. I don't want to show the film anymore."
A Clockwork Orange had been playing successfully for 61 weeks, but continuing press attacks and repeated threats of violence against him and his family drove Kubrick to withdraw the film from British cinemas. It was an astonishing display of director power.
what came over to us was that a filmmaker should have have the kind of power that he had to be able to do it. Because I think there's no other filmmaker actually who could ever stop any studio distributing their film, because studios are about making money. So for him to be able to have the power to do that was always astonishing to us. So particularly, I remember me as a young filmmaker thinking it's extraordinary that someone could do that. But more than that is that actually he had the will to do it.
It hurt him financially, but he didn't care about that. And it hurt Warner Brothers even more financially, but they obliged, because it wasn't worth it to them. Having peace with Stanley and making more films with Stanley and having Stanley under contract for the rest of his life, that was much more important to Warner Brothers than whether Clockwork Orange plays in England or not.
For the release of A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick went way beyond the role of a director, persuading Warner Brothers to adopt his ideas about how the film should be sold to the public.
If you're taking all the trouble with pre-production, with the shooting, with the post-production, and all the trying to get the film together and to approach it in so many different ways, I mean, why do you not be a part of it just when the public's going to see it?
If I'm not incorrect, Clockwork Orange was the second largest grossing film in the history of Warner's after My Fair Lady. And I used to meet with the foreign distribution guys and say, well, wait a minute. What we're doing here is following Stanley's instruction, and we're getting a remarkable result. We're grossing huge numbers on a picture that you predicted would be a catastrophe because it was so inaccessible. Is it not possible that he knows something that we don't know? Is it not possible that doing it his way is a better way? Or no, he doesn't know. He's just a pain in the ass.
Kubrick had a unique relationship with Warner Brothers, enjoying complete creative control and at the same time the support of a major Hollywood studio.
We all envied that more than anything, I think, over here. The fact that one studio would actually support an artist in that way is quite extraordinary.
For us, it was a question of wanting to work with a master, of wanting to do the movies of Stanley Kubrick. And there weren't runaway costs. It was always overblown and overestimated because he shot films for long periods of time. But he did them at such low cost. You'd walk on a Kubrick set, which was almost never allowed, I might add, and you'd marvel at the fact that there was hardly anyone there. I mean, compared to most movies, there'd be crowds. There'd be people standing around with donuts and passing coffee and people coming and going. So I saw it as an absolute priority. It was something that we were going to focus our attention on, and that was to continue to nurture the relationship and to enhance the relationship.
He was obviously always a step ahead of me, and he called me once. I remember I was at Warner's, and he said, I think it was around the time he was getting ready to do Linden. And he said, do you have any of those special BNC cameras that we used for rear process? I said, why? He said, well, I sort of sentimental reasons. I started out on them. I'd love to buy one from you if I could get one. So I called the camera department, and I said, do you have any of those? And they said, yeah, we've got a couple of those. I called Stanley back. I said, I've got a couple. He said, I'd love to get those cameras. I mean, I just, admire the workmanship. So I said, great. So I sent him off one of those, or maybe two of them. I can't remember. About 6 months later, Gottschalk, who ran Panavision for us and who was a sort of certified camera and opticals genius, called and said, why are you sending those rear projection cameras to Stanley Kubrick? I said, because he asked for them. I mean, they sit down there. We don't use rear projection anymore. We're doing front projection. He said, they're priceless. They are the most fantastic works that were ever put in a camera. They are brilliantly conceived and brilliantly executed camera works. You could never build a camera like that if your life depended on it. He said, I want to get every one I can because I can't duplicate the work that went into it. Stanley had anticipated it and acquired them and built his own cameras.
He looked for old-fashioned Mitchell BNC cameras for a very specific reason. These were the only cameras, to his knowledge, where he had a chance of fitting these big Zeiss lenses.
And Stanley sent me this lens and said, could I mount it on his BNC camera? I said, Stanley, it's absolutely impossible because the BNC has 2 shutters, a thick aperture plate, and all that between the film plane and the rear element of the lens. And so I explained that to Stanley and said we would have to damn near wreck your camera and make it purely dedicated to do this. And he said, fine, go ahead and do it. It originally was a lens manufactured, designed, developed, and manufactured by Zeiss for NASA. And, of course, NASA was planned to use it in satellite photography. And for that reason, it's an extremely fast lens. It's an f/0.7, which is 2 stops faster than the fastest lenses that are available even today. Of course, Stanley's intention for these lenses was to shoot the famous candlelit scenes in Barry Lyndon. And that being the case, he shot with the lenses wide open, f/0.7. And as a consequence of that, he had practically no depth of field at all. And it was quite a chore to do it, but of course, the images were absolutely gorgeous.
I think Stanley would have a concept of wanting to do something in a way that had never been achieved before, that he wanted to put himself into that century and with these characters and these settings and give you a way of seeing them as they would have been seen at the time that book was written. Yet he was using the most extraordinarily modern instruments and daring instruments, but the fact that he used these candles, and yes, and that's part of it, but also just the interiors, just the way sunlight came into rooms. It was to achieve the presence in a period in a way that I don't think anybody had ever done it before.
I knew it was a costume piece, but I had hoped he was going to take the costume, quote, costume piece somewhere else, and he took it back in time. And the use of the zoom lens is very interesting because you would never do. Who would think? You used a zoom lens in the past. Never. No, the zoom lens flattens it out like 18th century painting. And the movement, the body language, and the use of music, and again, the editing of the film. How transporting that moment is when Ryan O'Neal gives a wonderful performance, and Marissa Berenson, as he meets her for the first time, kissing her on the balcony with the music and how his body moves.
Stanley did not want the film to look like one of those traditional movies where period clothes look like wardrobes. He wanted the clothes to move, he wanted the clothes to have life, and he wanted to do something which was very reminiscent of certain painters of that period. Stanley sent me to all kind of auction houses were dealing with period costumes. So we were mixing some period costumes. So Stanley wanted beautiful materials because, as he quite rightly said, that's why in those paintings they give those wonderful lights. And everybody keeps talking about Barry Lyndon still now as one of the most beautiful 18th century movies. But it's because of the way he shot it, the way he pushed us to do our work.
You know, as an artist, you very often instinctively design, you know, and to intellectually justify your creativity is very difficult. And I think the same applies to actors. Though he knew and respected, I'm sure, the actors, he would permutate their performances almost to breaking point.
I remember going on the set one day and there were like 1,000 candles burning. And outside there was a huge storm. And there were these men standing outside, and because of the storm, they had to hold the big lamps. And there was a huge gale in Dublin, and the rain was pouring, and it was icy cold. I thought, poor guys, hope they don't have to do it too long. And then the candles are burning down very gradually, and Stan is just sitting there with Hardy Kruger discussing the problem that Hardy had. And he's just saying, well, Hardy, I think we should do it, because, you know, Hardy Kruger, I think, was getting also in a state. So it was interesting, never getting flustered, never raising his voice.
Well, he was wonderful working with actors because it was just one-to-one. You know, you had a relationship with the director. And if he was working in any detail on a role with an actor, well, you know, the others were there, sure. But it was just you and him.
What is your call, Lord Wellington?
Heads.
It is heads. And Lord Bullingdon will have the first half. Lord Bullingdon, will you take your ground?
And it was the fact that Stanley was so open and so engaging. When I asked him a question, you know, it might be about the lighting, it might be about the camera, the lenses, he would just take the trouble to speak about it and talk about it in a really, well, detailed way so that I understood what was happening, and that's what really stimulated me and interested me. I mean, for instance, you know, if he came onto the floor, he didn't know how to shoot a scene. I mean, he wasn't sure how he was going to do it. And I also, as an actor, I found that stimulating because what he was saying to me was, you know, do whatever it is you think you're going to do, you know, but do it for real, because that may change the way I'm thinking about the scene.
Sir Richard, this pistol must be faulty. I must have another one.
I'm sorry, Lord Bullingdon, but you must first stand your ground and allow Mr. Linden his turn to fire.
Oswald Stanley was a filmmaker most appreciated by his fellow filmmakers. Critics were always looking for something that wasn't in the movie, and then they were disappointed. And I suppose, in a way, I think that's a little bit Stanley's fault. For example, Barry Lyndon. I mean, I think everybody was expecting a kind of raucous Tom Jones kind of a movie. And you realize, as you look at the movie, that it's really about this slightly dim, handsome boy trying to find the clues and the cues to what's the right behavior, what's the behavior that's going to advance me in this society. So it's a movie really about a young man defining himself in a climate that's foreign to him. And that's not at all what people were led to believe this movie was about.
Barry Lyndon was released just as Hollywood entered the age of the blockbuster action movie. With a running time of nearly 3 hours, the film came in for heavy criticism and was labeled as tedious and boring by most critics in America and Britain. But in Europe, it was hailed as a film of breathtaking beauty.
And remember, it won 4 Oscars. I mean, cinematography, production design, costume design, and the music. But I think, you know, Stanley was disappointed because, well, in the end, it wasn't a commercial success.
He was very, very, very sad and disheartened that particularly smaller papers and smaller television stations did not at all appreciate the tremendous effort that went into these films and, you know, just simply dismissed it.
Whatever movie Stanley made, what I love about his work is they are completely conscious. You may like them, you may not like them, you may say, well, what about this, that, or the other thing? But, you know, everybody pretty much acknowledges he's the man, and I still feel that underrates him.
Kubrick's next project looked far more commercial. With Stephen King's best-selling novel, The Shining, he seized the chance to make a film that would both satisfy him artistically and meet the demands of the box office.
I'm asking about The Shining, you know, it's such unusual. He says, well, in reality, this is an optimistic picture. And I said, on what basis, Stanley? And he said, as the
existential, pragmatic man that he was, he said, well, in some way this movie's about ghosts. Anything that says there's anything after death is an optimistic story.
There are still images in The Shining that I wake up screaming about. That little boy in the hall and the
tracking of the Steadicam.
The little boy on the bicycle.
Of the little boy.
The sense of movement that gave that picture inside this very, very foreboding place.
You know that something is building up in this place, and the way it's the blandness, let's say, of the people, how quiet they are. And
is Tony the one that tells you things?
Yes.
How does he tell you things?
It's like I go to sleep, and he shows me things, but when I wake up, I can't remember everything.
Has Tony ever told you anything about this place? About the Overlook Hotel?
It's holding back this extraordinarily emotional, powerful, dramatic punch that's going to happen. You know it's going to come somehow, and at some time. And it just creates such suspense.
Is there something bad here?
At first, I was taken aback by some of the performance, and then, after the third or fourth viewing, I understood the level of intensity what Nicholson was doing.
I'm not sure that is intended to be what a typical horror movie is, which is a realistic portrayal of supernatural spookiness. I think that what's going on in that movie is largely going on in Jack Nicholson's head.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance.
You know, I like the kind of film he makes. I don't need to be naturalistic in a film to feel satisfied as an actor. You know, one of the things he said to me that I've always remembered was in movies you don't try and photograph the reality. You try and photograph the photograph of the reality. And I knew it wouldn't be a performance about idiosyncratic behaviorism, but that it would be, I always thought of it as balletic in The Shining. Like another lesson was here, Jack. The script says Jack is not writing. Well, the question is, what is he doing? I said, well, you know, whenever I'm inside a big empty place that you normally wouldn't be alone in, I always think of doing things that I might do outside, and that's where throwing that tennis ball all during the picture, and, you know, it wound up being a big part of staging. It rolls into things. It's thrown the length of hallways, you know, all of those kinds of things. And it's from those little things that he would develop sort of preconceived idiosyncrasy. You know, I mean, he always knew what he was going to get. He said often that every scene really has been done. Our job is always to do it just a little bit better.
Mr. Grady, you were the caretaker here.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
We had a good good, friendly relationship. You know, I mean, he'd turn on you in a moment and say, all right, you're the big fella, let's see it. And that's about as harsh as he ever got with me. I mean, he was a completely different director with Shelley.
Right. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll video? We're killing ourselves out here, and you're going to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing right by the door. No, I can't.
Yeah, but when you came out like this, you said,
we're sitting there because they say, wait a minute, and then you say on the radio,
but when you do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time there.
I can't even get the door open.
For a person so charming and so likable, indeed lovable, he can do some pretty cruel things when you're filming, because it seemed to me at times that the end justified the means.
Here's Johnny.
It was a very difficult role. It was a long shoot, and I had to cry and hyperventilate and carry a little boy and run, for most of the time we shot. And that was about a year, a little over a year. And anywhere between 30 and 50 videotaped rehearsals before we even rolled film. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. Why? Because of Stanley. And it was a fascinating learning experience. It was such intense work that I think it makes you smarter. But I wouldn't want to go through it again.
We were working with the material that was in the book and trying to make music that fit the mood of a sort of updated Gothic horror story, which is what The Shining is, really. I mean, as a novel in any case. And, of course, the stylization that came out through the filming was not present in the book. And so we failed in our attempt, which is why there was a great deal of other music put into the movie.
Manny, you win. Let's take the rest of this walking, huh?
A lot of the music cues are combinations of some of Ligeti's music, some of Penderecki's music. And lots of background patterns and textures with heartbeats and sizzling electronic little weird sounds. And those were all mixed together. That's how Stanley finally did what he was looking for.
When The Shining was released, the response was mixed. Some people appreciated its riddles and ambiguities. Others felt that Kubrick had strayed too far from Stephen King's book.
When I say that the people who love Stanley's movies were mostly movie people, they're just looking at what's in the frame. What's the moviness of the movie? They, of course, love Stanley I find, in a very uncomplicated way. Whereas, the critical community tends to fuss and fidget over what Stanley did.
After The Shining, Kubrick and his family moved to a large rambling mansion in the Hertfordshire countryside. Except when filming on location, he would now do all his work here, supported by a small and dedicated team.
The joke line we had about Stanley was, and this was the line you would never ever hear from Stanley, was, don't bother me with the details. I've got complete faith and trust in your judgment. Stanley would involve himself, to such an extent with the detail of stuff that one thought perhaps was a bit beneath him. He should have been doing major stuff and not worrying about how you had certain files in your office. I guess Stanley saw it all as a package deal. You either cared or you didn't care.
When we went to Ireland on Barry Lyndon, he left this 15-page document, care instructions for how to look after the animals. And the 37th instruction is, if a fight should develop between Freddie and Leo, and that was a father and son tomcats that we had, the only way that you can do anything about it is to dump water on them. Try to grab Freddie and run out of the room with him. Do not try and pick up Leo. Alternatively,
If you open a door and just let Freddy get out, he can outrun Leo. But if he's trapped in a place where you can't separate them, just keep dumping water, shouting, screaming, jumping up and down and distracting him, waving shirts, towels. Just try and get them apart and grab Freddy.
I remember once he had a cat that was drinking excessively, and I said, well, perhaps you can measure how much that cat's drinking, Stanley. And he said, no, that's impossible. There are too many cats. And then he phoned back a couple of minutes later and he said, but I could count the number of laps. And he then said, now how much does each lap take up in terms of water? I said, I don't think there's any information on that. He said, well, leave it with me. I'll try and find out. And he'd go off and he'd try and find out from somewhere, and then he'd work it out and we'd have a figure. You know, he was compulsive in that sort of way.
He was a kind of ultimate Jewish mother. If an animal was ill, or if one of us were ill, I mean, Stanley was like Superman.
I was very, very ill myself for quite a while, and he was so sweet, so kind, so loyal. I mean, everything you want somebody to be, you know, he was. I mean, he was really, really kind. However, I mean, when you weren't ill, that's when you bought it.
He very seldom praised you because he had this obsession that if he praised you, you would fall to pieces and not do the job right. He knew how far he could push you. That was the other clever thing. Occasionally he pushed you a bit too far and then he was a bit confused why you were really angry.
Philosophically, he was just no nonsense. You know, honest, had his view. Very cool view of humanity. He was a warm guy at home. I mean, I'm sure everybody says that. Crazy about animals and, you know, but could be brutal with people that he worked with. You know, I mean, he wasn't all that way. I mean, sometimes he could be generous as well, but he felt everybody was an opponent. You know, no matter what, he wasn't sure didn't have an agenda of their own, and he wasn't going to have that on his pictures.
I'm asking the fucking questions here, Private. Do you understand? Sir, yes, sir. Well, thank you very much. Can I be in charge for a while? Sir, yes, sir. Are you shook up? Are you nervous? Sir, I am, sir. Do I make you nervous? Sir! Sir, what? Are you about to call me an asshole?
Full Metal Jacket was based on a novel, The Short Timers, by Gustav Hosford, a Vietnam veteran. He collaborated on the screenplay with Kubrick and Michael Herr, who had covered the war as a correspondent.
He was thinking about making a war movie. And I said, well, Stanley, you already made Paths of Glory. And he said, well, people think of that as an anti-war movie. I want to make a war movie. Just to consider the subject, you know, without a moral position or a political position, but as a phenomena.
Holy shit, that's
And what he ended up doing in Full Metal Jacket, he had the detachment of the view. It's like a God's eye view of combat in the second half of the film. It seems to be so still and removed. The cleanliness of it, and the power of it. And the beauty of it, because it was also beautifully filmed. And he understood that it was accepted, that it was quite okay to acknowledge that among all the things that war is, it's also very beautiful.
It's the only film that's ever done that, to give you a real idea of what it's like, and also what the kids have got to go through, and how important a drill sergeant is.
Oh, that's right, Private Pyle. Don't make any fucking effort to get up to the top of the fucking obstacle. If God wanted you up there, he would have miracled your ass up there by now, wouldn't he? Say it, sir! Get your fat ass up there, Pyle!
And also the nature of the tragedy of it.
What is your major malfunction, numbnuts? Didn't Mommy and Daddy show you enough attention when you were a child? Easy, Leonard. Go easy, man.
And then the whole movie changes and moves out. And it was interesting, too, about Kubrick, is that the structure is all. He doesn't deal with traditional dramatic structure, which is good. He was experimenting.
Looked like something, didn't it?
Yeah.
You know, for a director who's perceived as being, completely uptight and controlling, and he was very free-form, Stanley. You know, he'd try anything. He'd ask the actors in for long meetings and say there's no such thing as a stupid idea in this context. If you have an idea, just say it. You know, and he'd often adopt them. I'm not saying Stanley wasn't a control freak. I would never say that. But there were many ways in which he was not controlling.
Should probably not be. Should be more frightened and then get into it. Do something brilliant.
I loved him. I enjoyed his sense of humor, but I would be lying if I didn't say that there were times when he was incredibly difficult. If you weren't willing to solve the problem as much as he was trying to solve it, if you weren't is devoted to understanding what it was that he was trying to go after, it was really hard for him. And I think that the thing was sometimes you didn't know what it was that he was looking for. You know, I remember walking around Beckton Gas Works and stumbling around by myself, and Stanley drove up in the Jeep, and he said, you know, what's wrong? Why are you walking around? I said, I don't know. I don't know what it is that you want from me. And he said, are you crazy? He said, get in the Jeep. He says, I'm not. I don't want you to do anything. I want you just to be yourself. That's all I want.
You write Born to Kill on your helmet, and you wear a peace button. What's that supposed to be, some kind of sick joke?
No, sir.
What is it supposed to mean?
I don't know, sir.
You don't know very much, do you?
No, sir.
You better get your head and your ass wired together, or I will take a giant shit on you.
Yes, sir.
Now answer my question, or you'll be standing tall before the man.
I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir.
The what?
The duality of man, the Jungian thing, sir.
Whose side are you on, son?
Kubrick shot part of Full Metal Jacket in East London, where a derelict gasworks was transformed into the bombed-out city of Hue, Vietnam.
The four key elements were the demolition, the signage, palm trees, and the smoke. And most of this was shot magic hour. Magic hour, it is that delightful time of the day when you're all exhausted and the light is perfect.
All right. He's dead.
You impart what you know and collaborate very much with Stanley. It's not easy to impress him with what you do, but the fact of the day, if you come out not ticking off about something, you know you've done pretty well. You get very close. You're part of the family, and it's a unit that works very close, hand in glove, because you're there 24 hours a day, sometimes with him, and you eat, drink, and sleep it. There's no life outside of film with Stanley. And if you enjoy it, there's no greater experience in my mind.
Everybody earned their pay when they worked for Stanley. But nobody earned their pay the way Stanley earned his pay. No one worked as thoroughly, deeply, obsessively as Stanley did. And he understood that when you're making a movie, you often don't know what it is you want until you see it.
Should we try it? Let's give it a crack.
One way or another, I felt utterly compensated for my time with Stanley. You know, if you're in it only for the money, you might have a different feeling about it. But my feeling was that, I have absolutely no complaints.
Kubrick had started work on the idea for Full Metal Jacket in 1980. When the film was released 7 years later, several Vietnam movies had already reached the screen. Kubrick, the great innovator, had been overtaken by other filmmakers. But Full Metal Jacket still appealed to a wide audience because it bore all the distinctive hallmarks of a Stanley Kubrick film.
He didn't ever like the fact that he made so few films. He always wished he could have done more. And if he had anything negative in his life, I think it was that feeling that he was slow.
I suppose the other thing I noted about Stanley was that there were still magnificent obsessions that he had that he never quite realized. His fascination with the Second World War and with the movie industry and Goebbels during that period.
For years, Kubrick had tried to find a way of portraying the appalling inhumanity of the Holocaust on screen. Now he turned Louis Begley's book, Wartime Lies, into Aryan Papers, the story of a Jewish family in Poland trying to evade capture by the Nazis. By the time he was ready to go into production, Steven Spielberg had begun shooting Schindler's List. Feeling the similarities were too great, Kubrick reluctantly shelved Aryan Papers.
There was another thing that he felt it just couldn't be told. If I really want to show what I have read and know happened, and he read everything, how can I even film it? How can you even pretend it? He became very depressed during the preparations, and I was glad when he gave up on it because it was really taking its toll.
Now Kubrick turned his attention to another long-standing project, based on a short story by Brian Aldiss. But AI evolved into such a mammoth undertaking that Kubrick eventually sought the collaboration of another director.
He said, you really ought to direct AI and I should produce it for you. And I was shocked. I said, yeah, right. He said, no, I'm serious. He said, it'll be great. It'll be a Stanley Kubrick production of a Steven Spielberg film. I remember him actually, giving me a title card on the whole proposal. And I said, why would you want to do that, Stanley? Because this was something I knew he had been developing from his heart for so long and had contributed so many elements beyond Brian's original, short story. And Stanley just said, well, I think it's this movie is closer to your sensibility than mine. And he was so insistent, in fact, he said, when can you come out here and talk to me about this in person? And I said, well, when would you like me to come out here? He said, tomorrow morning. And I was on Long Island. It was during the summer. So I got on an airplane the next day and I flew to his kitchen. And we, for the first time, sat down and he said, I'm going to show you these storyboards. And he started to show me a plethora of work that he had done on this picture.
It was a project which needed a lot of special effects, and he eventually postponed the project for technical reasons. Computer technology was about to explode, and he figured he would benefit enormously by waiting a few years. So the next project became Eyes Wide Shut.
When Eyes Wide Shut was announced as Kubrick's next film, celebrity columnists focused on the mysterious director who had not made a film or given an interview for over 10 years. They rehashed old stories, which Kubrick had never bothered to deny.
He had been pegged. Reclusive filmmaker, probably half mad. For a man to whom I think control was everything, the notion that he could not, in the last analysis, control this image that had grown up about who he was, it must have brought him to sort of a kind of despair and sort of like, oh, the hell with it. If that's what they want to think, that's what they'll think, and I can't do anything about it.
He dealt with it the way he had to deal with it. I knew it was rubbish, and that was all that mattered to me. And it mostly was all that mattered to him, although the more disgusting things did upset him, and he would talk about that sometimes. But I know until the end of Eyes Wide Shut had started to say, right, well, now I'm going to do a few proper interviews and try and set the record a little straighter.
Yeah, he didn't want to be somebody who shoots tourists on his lawn and then gives them money when they bleed. But it also because it's another thing that fits into, the nerdy monster
sliming around in his house and hating women. I mean, he's surrounded by them. I think there are few men who knew as much about women as he did.
It's impossible for me to just be objective and say, well, he should have spoken up, he should have been more gregarious. Oh, he couldn't, he wasn't. Why should he?
He also had a great nerve. He would open the door to somebody who was looking for Stanley Kubrick, and he said he's not at home. Because for a long time, nobody knew what his face looked like.
He was very, very knowledgeable about things, Stanley. Deeply curious and interested in the world, which I think a lot of people aren't aware about that. They think for someone so obsessive and so committed to what he does, that the rest of the world might pass him by. But of course, as we all know, he funneled the world into his life, into his kitchen.
Well, here was a man who set up his life so that he was warmed constantly by his family and by his circle of friends, who worked in a situation where he was a matter of minutes from the place that he worked. Who among us would be anything but envious of the way he's managed to set up his life?
The book is a tract about, what are the dangers of married life? What are the silent desperations of keeping an ongoing relationship alive? And what are the choices? You're either in that or you're not in that. And Stanley was very, very much a family man and in it. And the conjectures that he made about what it might be like outside it had a lot to do with what he was curious about.
It was a theme that we both talked about a great deal. And he thought about it in many different ways. It used to come back over the years again and again. And as you see friends getting divorced and remarried, and the topic would come up again. And it had so many variations and so much really serious thought to it that he knew one day he was going to make it.
May I ask why a beautiful woman, who could have any man in this room, wants to be married?
Why wouldn't she?
Is it as bad as that?
As good as that.
Stanley's expectations of people were not really, really high. And you see it in his films. And there was human beings that he loved. I mean, Christiane was the love of his life. And he would talk about her he adored her. And that's something that people didn't know. His daughters adored them. And I would see that because he would talk to me about them very proudly. But his understanding of humans was that we are very bittersweet. But he admired, I think, passion and commitment and loyalty. Because ultimately Eyes Wide Shut is about that commitment. It's a very hopeful film. People see it as a very dark film, but it's not. It's very hopeful.
Alice, I must see you again.
That's impossible.
Why?
Because I'm married.
His films are often thought to be without pity. That's a good quality, it seems to me, because he's saying to us, we are like this. We are hopeless, muddled, fallible, desperate, needing love human beings. And in the end, I think that's what is the central quality of his films. He tells us about human beings as we are, not as we'd like to imagine that we are.
The heart of it was illustrating a truth about relationships and sexuality, but it was not illustrated in a literal way, but in a theatrical way.
People said, well, the streets don't look like New York. I said, well, in a way, I said, it doesn't matter. Look at the name of the street. I said, no such street exists in New York. I said, in a funny way, it's as if you're experiencing New York in a dream, It seems like New York, but it's not. It seems like your wife, But what is she telling me? And do I want to know? Maybe I shouldn't ask.
Because I'm a beautiful woman. The only reason any man ever wants to talk to me is because he wants to fuck me? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think it's quite that black and white, but I think we both know what men are like.
So on that basis, I should conclude that you wanted to fuck those two models.
There are exceptions.
What makes you an exception?
I took that character of Bill home with me. And at times that was not a nice place to be sitting in that character for that amount of time. It really is not the kind of person that I am, that contained, non-communicative, likes the daily routine, the stability of his life, just, ignoring his wife in that relationship and just not wanting to rock the boat. Taking things for granted, Bill did. Took her for granted, took his family for granted, his life for granted. It's just a little too smug, and she just goes, bang.
I first saw him that morning in the lobby. He was checking into the hotel, and he was following the bellboy with his luggage to the elevator. He glanced at me as he walked past, just a glance. Nothing more. But I could hardly move.
When we went in to rehearse that scene, it was the three of us, and we just kind of got in our underwear and not Stanley. We got in our underwear. And we just talked about the scene and just kind of didn't really worry about the lines too much at that point. It just slowly evolved. And we were doing take after take. I said, Stanley, what do you want? He said, I want the magic. I want the magic. But then as the scene progressed, as take after take doing it, you'd feel the scene reach a level, and everyone felt, oh, well, that's acceptable, that's interesting. And then we'd keep working on it, and it would feel bad, it was stale, it wasn't working. And then suddenly we could feel it break into a place that none of us had really thought of before.
The whole process of the film was a discovery. It was never about the result. It was never about, well, we have a week to shoot this scene, so quick. We have to do it. Let's see. We may not fully explore it, but we'll get something good. As Stanley wanted to explore every avenue and then make his decisions based on that. And Stanley was not restricted by time. He refused to be. And that is a great luxury that only somebody like he could afford because of what he'd achieved through his career, to be able to say, do you want to know what's gold with filmmaking? Time is gold. Not having to walk away from a scene before you feel like you really perfected it.
And I wanted to make fun of you. To laugh in your face. And so I laughed as loud as I could. And that must have been when you woke me up.
And the other thing Stanley hated doing was ever explaining himself. So what's the film about, Stanley? He'd look down and look away and not answer. And the same thing applied to a scene. So what do you really want this scene to be? He would never answer that.
Eyes Wide Shut seems to be a rake's progress story. He goes on an adventure that could really turn out any way, and it's a sort of an irresponsible adventure for him to embark on. But it's a fantasy, isn't it? It's a dream film. I don't think we're supposed to believe anything that we see. And I think that one thing that people do have a hard time with in the cinema is ambiguity. Ambiguity is great. But in the cinema, it's almost verboten.
In a way, perhaps the most extraordinary example of how a piece of music is used to drive home something about character and story and atmosphere of a film is in Eyes Wide Shut.
Please, come forward. I was in Stalinist, terroristic Hungary, where this kind of music was not allowed, and I just wrote it for myself. Stanley Kubrick understood the dramatism of this moment, and this is what he did in the film. And for me, when I composed it in the year 50, in Budapest, desperately, it was a knife in Stalin's heart.
He had that director's disease of really imagining the easy part of it until you get there, you know. I'm sure he did not go into Eyes Wide Shut expecting to shoot for 14 months. But I must say, I thought the same thing. I said, well, I'll be out of here in 3 days. The first scene we did in 2 hours or something that night at the house where they come in and I just say hello. And so I said, well, what are all these things I hear about? It's going to take forever. I went there, and 3 hours later I was back at the hotel in London. This is going to be a snap.
I remember even him teasing me, saying, what are you doing, Cruz? I said, I know, it's great having you here, Sidney. You're perfect. You're just fantastic, because we shot it in a day.
And then,
of course, the next day, Sidney comes out, and he's dressed. He's got his sleeves up. He's in his pants. He knows every line of this massive, scene there. And he says, come on, let's run lines. Let's go, Tom. Let's go, Cruz. Let's go. I got to go. I got a week. And again, we're going to jam this out. And I'm going to, it's going to be fantastic. And we're doing the Steadicam shot of me coming into the room, And so Sidney goes, look, all right, how do you want me to do this? And Stanley said, well, I don't know, let's try it and see. He says, well, I can go to the door fast. Okay, well, let's see what that's like. He says, okay, now open the door. And then he says, well, maybe that's a little too fast. Okay, I can go slower. So we start doing the scene this way.
By the third week, when we're in the billiard room, I'm saying, my God, how...
Of course, said Stanley. He said, well, Sidney, I mean, I didn't think it would be much longer than that, but don't you want to get it right?
I tell you, there are a lot of people in our business who are, well, they label themselves perfectionists. That's a kind of a euphemism for a pain in the ass, really. Stanley was the first real perfectionist that I met. I mean, there just wasn't any way for him to go one take less, or he never gave an inch on anything.
So much was expected of him every time. He wasn't allowed just to make a movie. It had to be an amazing movie, because so many of us actually were waiting for the next Stanley Kubrick film. It had to be an event. And I think on his shoulders, therefore, was a terrible responsibility in a way.
When Eyes Wide Shut was finally shown for the very first time in New York on March 1st, 1999, to Tom and Nicole and the heads of the studio, the response was very enthusiastic. Stanley was very, very happy, and a great heavy weight was lifted from his shoulders. I think this change of his being caused almost a physical change in his body, because he had lived with this enormous responsibility for a very expensive film, which was long in the shooting for a long time, for 2 years, and suddenly it was all gone. He died a week later.
The enormous intensity that Stanley had with his work, he also applied to his family. And I always felt very much loved, and so did the children. And he was consistent in that he always said, either you care or you don't.
Well, Stanley was always a man who never wanted to repeat himself. No. He reinvented himself with every single motion picture he directed. As a filmmaker, for me, he was a conceptual illustrator of the human condition.
You say, well, gee, I wish he'd made more, but these were enough. Because there's so much in each one. There's so much. Yeah, it would have been nice for him to make more. But that's not the process. That wasn't his process. And what he did make was something that's so special and unique. It's like a different movie every time you see it.
I think as a director, I think that what we all admired the most was that it was a single vision. It was one man's vision. And no one interfered with that vision. And the complete control that he had in the making of his films, that meant that whatever it had in the back of his head was up there on the screen. And I know that he struggled a lot to get to that place. I think it's something that all of us actually have benefited from.
Two major artists were Orson Welles and Stanley, in terms of being, genuine, no-holds-barred artists. So I would put him in the pantheon of the absolute top film directors that the world has seen.
And was one of the people that sort of knew what was wrong with the world in a weird way and was able to turn that into art. He just didn't grouse about it or bitch or write lousy editorials. He converted it into something that was amazing and important for us as a species.
I always thought I'd work with Stanley again. We kept in touch over the years and everything and talked about other projects. And it's a sad thing that I won't have that great opportunity.
I miss him. How could one not miss him?
He was a man who is completely unique. He's a man I loved and admired. With all the difficulties he had with him. He was not an easy person. It didn't matter. Obviously I worked with him for 30 years for good reasons.
Stanley is gone. There's never going to be another Kubrick film. You will never have a film that will look like this ever again, because it is Stanley. And he pushed everyone to the limit. He pushed the film to the limit. He pushed, the actors emotionally, but because we all wanted to go there with him.
Part of Stanley's legacy on my life is that you believe in something, you passionately believe in something, so devote yourself to it completely, utterly, and don't apologize for doing it.
He felt extremely lucky to be in a situation where he could tell stories on such a large scale and millions of dollars involved. I think when he was young, he didn't dare hope he would be able to do that. I don't think he ever took that for granted. And he would often say to people, say, how are you doing, Stan? He said, I'm still fooling them.